Welcome to the 14th chapter of the Book of Zechariah. I'm going to title this section The Mount of Olives. It began, 14 began with the day of the Lord, and it went through and it showed where Jerusalem, and I mentioned how many places, I think it was 42, that the word Jerusalem is mentioned in this book. So it's the key to all the things going on here, Jerusalem. And it's going to be a captured city. We went through all that in the first section. The second section then went in, the Lord shall come and shall deploy. And we had the war that was going on. Now it continues in verse 4, and it says, and now his feet shall stand. Now we know who his is. In that day upon the Mount of Olives, the one over against Jerusalem according to the east. We'll go to a map. And we see right here, this is Jerusalem, all of this in the Kidron Valley. Mount of Olives were over here, and the Temple Mount was over here. Now, 2 Samuel 15:30 mentions and says, and David ascended upon the ascent of the olive groves, ascending and weeping, and his head being covered over, and he went barefoot when he was escaping from his son Absalom. So I believe that's the first place that it's mentioned in the Old Testament outside of then here. Now, olive trees and other things like that were mentioned throughout, but as far as a specific place is only here, I believe, in 2 Samuel. But the New Testament is a little different. The New Testament we have in Matthew 26:30. It says, and having sung praise, they went forth into the Mount of Olives. And that's also Mark 14:26. So right here we see that a place that Jesus went to, his feet were on the Mount of Olives, just as the words in Zechariah said it would happen. His feet would be on the Mount of Olives. And in Mark 11:1, it says, and when they approached unto Jerusalem, unto Bethphage and Bethany, to the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples, and they went in. So Bethphage and Bethany are here. They went into Jerusalem, preparing for Jesus' arrival on the donkeys. And then in Mark 13:3, it says, and as he was sitting in the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, so you can see where it's opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him, and they asked him about the completion of all the signs of the end, and when Jesus' return, things like that. Luke 19:37, it says, of his approaching already to the descent of the Mount of Olives, all the multitudes of the disciples began rejoicing to praise God with a great voice for all which they beheld of works of power. So now Jesus is coming and going into Jerusalem with all the disciples rejoicing and thinking, well, he's going to be crowned as king, but unfortunately no. And then in Luke 21:37 it says, and he was by days in the temple teaching, and by nights coming forth to lodge in the mountain being called Olives. A little bit different way, a mountain being called Olives. And that would, of course, be the Mount of Olives. And then in Luke 22:39, and going forth, he went according to custom unto the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him also. So he would go there many times. And then in John 8:1, and Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, and at dawn again he came into the temple, and all the people came to him, and having sat, he taught them. So these are all the places that mentions the Mount of Olives in the New Testament, except for one more place. And we will go to that. And that is in Acts 1:9-12. And it's right here. And it says in Acts, probably written by Luke, and having said these things of their looking, he was lifted up, and a cloud undertook him from their eyes, and they were in Jerusalem. because Jesus says to wait there. There would be where they're at. And as they were gazing into the heaven at his going, and behold, 2 men stood by them in white attire, angels, ones who also said, Men, Galileans, why do you stand looking into the heaven? They're all looking. And this Jesus, being taken up from you into the heaven, so will come in which manner you saw him going into the heaven. Then they returned unto Jerusalem from the mount being called Olive Grove, which is near Jerusalem, sufficing for a Sabbath journey. Jesus will return, and he will return on the Mount of Olives. So Zechariah has it right here. In that day, he will stand there, but then it's going to split when he's there, half of it towards the east and the west, an exceedingly great chaos, and half of the mountain shall lean towards the north, and half of it towards the south. And now, our next section will go through the valley and what else happens in the book of Zechariah.